All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to the first edition of Tuesday webinars powered by Acutus AI. I am Arindam Bhattacharya, the founder of Acutus AI, where we're experimenting with how decisions are made by blending AI with human understanding. At Acutus, we've been obsessed with one fundamental question right from the start. What kind of data do we really trust to drive decisions? And especially when those decisions are being made by machines and at scale. Well, today's topic strikes right at the heart of this. What's the role of real respondents? What's the role of verified data? And what about synthetic data that which also comes in shaping AI-driven insights? Well, in a world flooded with data, the real challenge isn't the access to it. It's the confidence in the data that we have access to. So as researchers, marketers, and data scientists, we all asking the same questions. What's representative enough to predict human behavior? Is the data trustworthy enough to train an AI model? And how do we combine human nuance with machine precision? Well, to help us unpack all of that, I am thrilled to announce someone who's been living these questions long before they became mainstream. Friends, please welcome Frank Pica, the CEO and founder of Native AI. Well, Frank has been on the front lines of AI innovation, from leading machine learning startups to nine-figure exits, to exploring emotional intelligence in humanoid robots. And now he's pioneering how brands use AI to understand customers and design products in real time. At Native AI, he's helping businesses bridge gap between what people want and what they experience. And he's using AI not just as an analysis engine, but as a creative partner. I have had a couple of interactions with Frank, and what I admire about him is how he pushes us to think bigger, not just about better data or faster models, but about how AI can co-create with us, not in the future, but right now. So welcome, Frank, and let's just dive into this. Frank, quickly starting off with the first segment, and then without beating around the bush, let's talk about real world versus the synthetic data. I mean, we all know you've been in this space for quite some time. I have spent years in the consumer insights industry, and we've seen how real world data is basically the gold standard for consumer insights and research, right? But I would tend to believe that synthetic data is kind of challenging the status quo. From your experience, is this really a either or decision, or do you think that the reality is actually a little bit more nuanced?
Love the question, and great to be here today. I really appreciate you inviting me on. Yeah, I think definitely a bit more nuanced, right? I don't think that this is necessarily a binary decision between real respondents, right, or synthetic data. I think it's really a big opportunity to look at how we blend the two in order to find a faster, cheaper, kind of more reliable way, right, to get to ground truth. And so I feel that we're at this very pivotal moment where the research world right now is being reshaped, not just by our AI, right, but by the evolving definition of like what data quality actually means.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would tend to think that the biggest, the biggest misconception is that synthetic data is just a shortcut for when we can't afford real data or when we don't have access to real data. But actually, if I look at it, in many cases, especially when you're testing edge cases or rare behaviors, it actually gives you control and scalability that real data probably doesn't, or maybe it cannot. In fact, I've seen situations when we're running experiments within Acutus with synthetic respondents. They've given us insights on why something wasn't working rather than, not just what is not working. It's also giving the why to the what as well. From your perspective, and you spent a lot more years than I have you seen use cases where synthetic simulations have revealed behavior that real data didn't actually show up?
It's a great question. I think looking at some of the more traditional methods of data collection, there's certainly are gaps. And, if we look at what synthetic data truly represents, it's actually more of like a raw material. And I say that in the sense of, imagine trying to build a dinosaur again. Okay. We're going to take this far out. That dinosaur, you're going to collect an initial gene or DNA that is essentially incomplete, right? And that's what we're limited to today. In order to kind of fill in those gaps, right? Think of synthetic data as kind of that raw material or additional DNA that you can kind of insert into the strand to then create a more comprehensive or holistic picture of the person, or in that instance, right, to create a complete dinosaur. So what we've seen is, yes, it definitely allows a more comprehensive or 360 view of human behavior, of even psychology. But then you get down the path of, again, how well can we actually trust this, right? So there's a huge and necessary means for the industry to continue to validate. And that's, I'm sure, a whole nother topic we'll dive into here shortly.
Absolutely. And good that you bring this point up. And I will also go back to the completing the dinosaur bit. I think we'll delve on that topic a little bit later. But because you've pointed on trust, well, I mean, why do researchers still hesitate? I mean, I would think that from a researcher standpoint, I think they still tend to believe, or they probably trust real data because it's observable. But if you still look at it, I mean, real data has its flaws, right? I mean, the biased samples, poor recall, misreporting, and we all know the recent cases in terms of data quality that we've had very recently, right? I mean, the click farms and AI bots, whatever, right? Like it feels that, I mean, sometimes when I'm experimenting in this space, I tend to feel that synthetic data is actually being held to a higher standard than real data ever was. I mean, what do you, from your perspective, what do you think it will take for synthetic data to be trusted as a decision grade, maybe by default?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Look, from our perspective, and it's a bit biased, right? Coming from my side of the table, having spent, as you mentioned, 7 years kind of working towards the challenge here. I think it's already happening, and I say that we've had really the luxury and the pleasure of working hand in hand with market research agencies and true researchers. And they are some of the most intelligent and rigorous people, right, in the world, quite possibly. But what we're also noticing is that there's a huge surge of sort of end clients, right, looking for faster, scalable, but still very reliable ways of generating that insight, right, or coming to that conclusion. So what will it take? I don't think much, quite honestly, at this point. I think the tip of the iceberg, we're already there. And now we're about to find out how big that iceberg really becomes. And to your point earlier, it's not to say that traditional research methods don't have a huge place in the future. Again, I just think there's a far better way of kind of combining these approaches to not only get a more reliable, output or more comprehensive output, but the other big things that comes to mind is, we really haven't been held accountable from a research agency or research perspective for the business outcome in quite some time. So I think what's essentially happening is the hens are coming home to roost, if you will. And what I mean by that is we've kind of almost fell victim to our own creation. We pass on an insight. The insight is then used by the client to, essentially create a new product or create a new marketing messaging. And then the result is to no fault, right, of the research. I think actually now we have an opportunity to take a little more accountability for the final outcome. And as we look at things like attribution and measurement of that outcome, AI, right, presents a huge opportunity to really change the way we've done business. And yes, there's a little more scrutiny. Yes, there's a little more pressure, but quite honestly, the end result is going to be far better, not only for the clients, but also for the end consumer, right, who has to essentially determine whether or not to buy that product or whether they like, the product being created. So
absolutely makes sense. And again, like I said, we've just started experimenting Acutus small pilot, and what we did was some unincentivized behavioral OTT viewing and app switching patterns, and we helped train a small model primarily catering to Gen Z, how they binge watch based on their behaviors. And what we did was we also ran a parallel survey, and I can tell you we kind of still running the experiment, but what we see is that the data which we use to train our models, I mean, us much more nuance. It is kind of giving us much more nuanced insights that maybe just normal cannot. And I think we will just discuss this topic a little bit later in one of the in as well for discussion. But are you seeing, or have you in your 7 years that you've been doing this, are you seeing similar values from verified micro data sets, especially when you care about the depth of the data rather than the breadth of?
Sure. I think it's a great question too. Quantity isn't always everything, right? Part of, I think, the promise here with, something like synthetic data or digital twins is potentially you get much more coverage, right? So your sample sizes grow larger. You potentially tapped into underrepresented, right, or underserved audiences that traditional research methods haven't really cracked the code on. So there's a lot of promise around quantity, but to your point, that's not everything today. So there is this increasing emphasis on, well, if I'm going to train a digital twin, a synthetic respondent, if you will, right, let's maybe use less data that we know yields very high quality, and that potentially produces a better outcome. And so I would say at a broad stroke, right, I would agree. Quantity is important, but it certainly doesn't always translate to a better business outcome. So I think in that same vein, we not only need to focus on high quality data and obviously the definition of what that means, but ultimately we need to be better about measuring like what was that business outcome. And I'll go back to that again because I think it's so freaking important for us to do. The research could be flawless. It could follow methodology to a T. And as we've seen, there's a 95% fail rate of new products to market still. And all those companies have done traditional research. So the question really begs, is there a better way or a better method? And I think these high quality data sets and less emphasis on just, hey, I hit my in size and my quota is probably a much better way and effective way of getting to that promising business outcome.
Absolutely makes sense. I mean, if I have to just touch upon that example of OTT, what we did, one of the things that we did see was, interestingly, so there is this one persona that have a standard pattern of viewing what they view over a period of time, but suddenly on a particular day they don't have access to high speed internet. They move from a Wi-Fi 5G to a 3G, and suddenly you see a difference in the behavior and all that. And that, I think, is basically that nuanced context, right? If I just build a static persona and say that based on all the behavioral patterns, this is what they do, consumers actually don't do that, right? Their patterns change based on the environment that they are in. Interesting. So again, just going back to that point of like good data, from your perspective, and this is a question that I am kind of getting from my clients as I take Acutus to clients for POCs and stuff, is like, it's not about the data that is being perfect, or it's about not about the data being representative of decisions that you're trying to model. But the question comes is like, what makes data good enough to train your AI model? I mean, how do you define fit for purpose data when it comes to AI training? Is it context driven, or are there universal benchmarks that you follow? And this is purely from my understanding perspective as well. I am new to this field, and you spent enough years. So yeah, I mean, is it context driven, or are there benchmarks?
Sure. Yeah. I think right now, one of the biggest things that we can accomplish as like newcomers to the space, right? Even though 7 years, it's a decently long time, but let's be honest, we're new. One of the biggest things we can establish right now in the industry are benchmarks for this. We are helping kind of lead the way in that capacity. So we've partnered with not only market research firms, but we're also partnering with Gartner to help us measure and help create benchmarks.
Right.
Your question earlier, what data is suitable? So I view there's like a few milestones, right, that we attempt to make with all of our partners. And there's early milestones, there's later milestones. So, to help build that foundation of trust, I think one of the early milestones that can be fairly easily accomplished is by utilizing parity. And so what I mean by that is if I have a synthetic or a digital twin, right, and I also have a human population that it is supposed to represent. So we got two buckets.
Yeah.
I have a survey, right, or a list of questions that I would like to ask. So one of the easy things that you can do is simply, I run that survey through digital twins. I take that same survey, right, and I run that in parallel against some humans, and I measure something called parity. So what is the essentially, alignment between the digital twin responses and the humans? It's a great first indication of trust, right? But again, to your earlier point, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is actually the most effective or best output for the business outcome or what we're trying to achieve. So the later milestone, right, that we continue to measure is, did that insight actually result in a lift in sales, right? If a company is using that to essentially improve their marketing campaign, or was the product that insight informed, that new product, was it successful in market a year down the road, 2 years down the road? And so that's what I mean by those kind of later stage, milestones. And so I think if we do that effectively, which really hasn't been done very well before, definitely not in market research, that is where we will find kind of the holy grail of, right, what is quality data? Right. Because you will understand what that quality data generated in terms of insight, and then what it generated in terms of outcome. So that is where I believe the entire industry will head if others aren't already heading there.
Right. I think that's really great insights, because like I said, I always get these questions like, if you've trained your model, what data did you use, and how do you validate that data is good enough to train your model and not something else? I think it's a step-by-step process, but that also kind of leads me to the second segment of what we want to discuss. And before we do that, folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it on the chat, and we'll take it up at the end of the discussion. But that leads me to the next bit of it, which is incentives and behavioral bias. Well, I mean, incentivized data is everywhere. When we talk about surveys, market research, quant, whatever, like, I mean, it's all, I would say almost most of it is incentivized, right? And from my perspective, I tend to believe that anything that is incentivized kind of messes with the actual human behavior. I really do this as and when I talk to clients as a POC, I've kind of, and OTT is kind of one of my favorite topics these days, but I tend to say that if you actually ask on a survey, if a respondent watches porn, he'd probably say no, because they might not want to answer that. But if you take passive behavioral data, you might find something else altogether, right? So how do you think incentives shape response quality, and what happens when you use that data to train AI models?
Sure. Love the porn example. Look, I think the funny thing here is, everyone knows the age-old saying, right? Garbage in, garbage out. I think that still applies. I don't consider all incentivized respondents garbage by any means. I think there are plenty of incentivized respondents that answer truthfully. And I think that, again, it adds a tremendous amount of quality data into the pool that is being used today. I think the broader kind of objective here, right, or challenge to overcome is simply, we need more types of data, right, included into these studies. And right now, the current limitations of the traditional methods really limit you in terms of like what you can use, mostly because it's a time and cost benefit analysis, right? So, I mean, if I could, I would certainly use several partners, right, to comprehensively stitch together this 360 view of my respondent. And I think it would result in a far better outcome, right, for the business or for the partner in that sense. So I think one of the ways we can address that is right now, more than ever, we are seeing data being shared, right, by people. Despite the privacy challenges, right, despite a lot of the concerns there, people are sharing more data online and offline that eventually ends up online than ever before. That is just point blank fact and truth. So this idea of using alternative data to help fill in some of those gaps to respondents is probably where the holy grail will live. Now, what I mean by that is, to your point, the same respondent that answered, no, I do not watch porn, we may find a cookie, right? Or we may find a clickstream piece of data that actually says quite the opposite. That person does indeed visit those types of websites. And so that is what, in a sense, is kind of the power of some of these like new systems powering research, such as digital twins. Is it's not just synthetic data, right? It's actually real data. It's alternative data that you can collect publicly, right, or through clickstreams. And then you can also fill in gaps. So it's kind of several raw materials coming together to create a new system that gives us a far more comprehensive view of a person than we would have ever gotten before in an online survey or even in a focus group at times. And so that is where I think, again, the real power and future lies for this industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I tend to agree, and I think we are kind of going back to the same fact. It's not an either or. It has to be collaboration. I mean, off late I've been writing on few LinkedIn posts and comments and everywhere. It's like, and I was also talking to somebody the other day, and I think, or maybe one of the LinkedIn posts where I put this comment in. I think what's happening is right now it's the way AI in general and synthetic data and everything's being projected is like, oh, it'll take away all our jobs. Market research no longer needed. Researchers are not needed. We don't need real. And I think I put it on the comment. It's like we're portraying it wrong. We're putting in that fear factor. It's not going to take away our jobs. It's not going to take away market research altogether. I think the thing is it's like it will collaborate to make things better rather than taking away everything and AI replacing everything. I mean, hopefully not in my lifetime at least. I mean, we will probably just see collaboration. But moving on, just and again, just continuing on that behavioral bias point and incentivized behavior. In fact, just delving on the fact that I mean, what does behavioral bias look at when it gets scaled? I mean, we've seen small distortions in behavior, right? They can seem harmless in isolation, but I feel that at scale, that those distortions then become a pattern that AI kind of learns from, right? I mean, if it's one data point with a distortion, not much, it's harmful. Harmless. But when that becomes 10,000 data points, and that like let's say 10,000 data points slightly exaggerating how often they buy a product, and we use that data to train AI, I think then the default truth kind of starts to kind of be a little bit distorted, right? I mean, do you think that most teams understand how even minor behavioral biases get magnified in AI models?
So it's a great question. I think the difficulty for using kind of an LLM or application out of the box is just that, right? It's a black box. It's not just out of the box, it's a black box in a lot of ways. Now, luckily, these models as a service, right, are being offered, and there are tons of companies developing fantastic solutions, right, that are going to help overcome that and provide chain of thought and also line of sight, right, to some of that foundational data that essentially seeds these synthetic personas or digital twins. I think this is also an area where quantity and frequency does become important. So kind of the reverse of what I said earlier, right? In order to like really help overcome some of those biases, and using let's say one quality, or what we think is quality, right, data set, and that compounding and actually creating, right, an inherent bias that continues to compound and continues to cause issues. Right. This is where, again, taking data at scale really helps, eliminate a lot of that bias. And I say that the more scale you get to, as long as you have quality assurance standards for that data, the more you should be able to eliminate that bias. Mm-hmm. The other piece of that is frequency. To your point earlier, right? Really, human opinion and human preference and behavior changes constantly. And so for the longest time, we've had a technical hurdle more than anything else. It's a logistical and technical hurdle. And that technical and logistical hurdle is actually going away. And that is due to the connectivity, right, of the world, not only sharing more data, but think of the world of sensors and the Internet of Things, right? Mm-hmm. All of these are even starting to bridge some of the online to offline gap that has traditionally been essentially segregated, right, and treated as, different partners with, I guess, very different and unique, I would say, benefits to the end client. And so I think you're going to see that gap continue to close, and that's just due to the nature of technology as well. So I would say those two things combined, frequency, reach, and quantity, right, are really going to be where you help address some of those biases that, starting with even a high quality data set, it's going to give you a good foundation, but you better be darn sure it's high quality, because if it's not, to your point, problems will compound.
Absolutely. And I love the point that you said about how behaviors change, or how it's human behaviors changing over a period of time. The fact that when we, like, at some point back in the day, we used to do these Gen Zs and silver surfers and millennials and whatnot. But interestingly, because we've been working on the Gen Z persona to quite a bit, what we're seeing is the trust level, like in terms of building trust on a brand, the kind of behavior that Gen Zs typically show is pretty similar to what actually 60 plus people do as well, which is interesting considering the age gap. But that is how they actually behave when it comes to building a trust on a particular brand. So that's actually an interesting point. But come back to our discussion, and because we think that AI can do everything and it can solve all our problems, are there any signals that AI can pick up to correct biases? I mean, can AI itself help spot, adjust distortions, and could AI just teach itself to understand context of the data and not just the content of the data?
It's a good question. I think there's a few ways, right, that companies are already trying to address that via weighting certain data points, et cetera. So there's this kind of like manual fine-tuning adaptation that's happening.
Okay.
I think that's a great way to do it. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's a very laborious way and fairly tedious as well. So while we do some fine tuning ourselves, I don't think it actually helps solve or necessarily completely account for biases. I'll go back to my earlier point, and this is kind of, we use this as a North Star at Native AI. But if I'm providing a really good business outcome for my client, my partner, then chances are, right, that will help eliminate some of the biases that exist in the data. And then it will do some kind of self-weighting, if you will, right, or start to account for some of the biases in the data. So I do think two things. Attribution becomes extremely important to have line of sight to. I think very little in the space today are actually doing that from market research agency side. I think it can be one of those things that we can all improve upon.
Right.
The second thing is, yes, if we want to address that rather quickly, and I would say imperfectly and definitely unsustainably from a scale perspective, then yes, there are things like fine tuning and weighting that can be addressed. But it also eliminates some of the power, right, of what AI is bringing to the table, which is scalability, flexibility, and kind of this opportunity to use it across numerous use cases, right, within research. So that's kind of my 2 cents. I'm not saying it's the best way, but it's certainly, one of the ways that we think we can achieve it at scale.
Makes sense. So basically, and I would really, the incentivized bit, let's call it the the lab world, I mean, real world behavior versus the lab world behavior. How big do you think is the gap? I mean, and this is again just coming back, taking some examples like I mean, if I do a survey, people might say that they never use phone while they are watching TV, but maybe when I collect passive data, we might just see something different. So I mean, I think we all know that the gap is there, and uh, again, AI trained on self-reported behavior, it might miss the truth entirely. So as how do we reconcile these two worlds when we're building AI models, especially when they kind of paint very different pictures? So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, you know, my North Star is going to continue to be my point of emphasis here. I think there's two things. One, this isn't about replacing research, as you know, right? This is about augmentation, really making insights more instant and kind of adaptive, not reactive in a lot of ways. This is how I would view AI as being probably most useful as it pertains to kind of filling in those knowledge gaps. I'll be quite honest, I don't know how big the gaps truly are. I think the gaps are fairly obvious, like where they exist, because those are the areas where clients are coming to, persons like yourself or persons like us, right, who are helping address and kind of like fill those gaps. So I think there's a ton of them. In terms of the width of such, that's always like very hard to determine, right? I think that only comes over time when we finally get to a point and realize, wow, we've been able to fill in X amount of knowledge, right, that we've never known before using artificial intelligence and something like synthetic data.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, wow, we've been able to accomplish a lot of things from a business perspective, success in products, increase in sales, that we weren't able to achieve with traditional research. And that'll be the real, I guess, defining moment for how large those gaps were. My guess would be they're pretty big.
Yeah. And also from purely teaching AI and purely training models, I would think that we need both kind of data. If I just keep training my AI on passive behavior, I think we're still missing that human nuance of like human behavior changes when they are incentivized or when they are being monitored or when they are being watched. And I think when we are training a model holistically, I think AI needs to know both the aspects and basically differentiate and say, okay, so if this is being monitored, trained, monitored or incentivized, this is how humans behave. This is how they behave when not monitored, not incentivized. And now when I'm training my model, basically it's a combination of both, right? Again, to the same point, it's not an either or, it needs to be both the inputs that need to go in, right?
I think so too. Yeah, I think, if we look at a respondent like a recipe, right? We're making a fantastic new dish. You're going to have Michelin star chefs, right? And you're going to have your line chefs. And what makes that dish so special is really the kind of blend, right? I use, this much real world behavioral, right? I had this much online, and then I had this much synthetic, and there's a balance there, right? And there's a formulation essentially that is going to equate to a very good result for customers or users of that product. Where that formulation exists for each partner could also be very different, right? Depending on the use case, depending on the industry, you're going to see different formulations that result in really good outcomes, but that'll just be an experimentation. So that is where I think a lot of the industry will continue to head, is you're probably going to have a more vertical approach to this technology, right? So really good companies that are good in a certain vertical are going to do really well with those types of customers. I do think there's kind of a top-down play as well from a technology perspective, but not necessarily the experts. And so again, to your point, are we replacing? No, I think you're going to have a lot of specialists in a lot of areas, industries, verticals, et cetera. And the AIs and solutions that they build will be, again, suited for that industry or vertical. But yeah, that would be my again, kind of like aha moment on what's probably going to work is
Yeah.
more of that vertical approach that we've seen in the past too.
Absolutely. I mean, over the past 6 months, I remember when we, Ankesh and I, started Acutus with synthetic and stuff. We were like, hey, we'll do this for finance, we'll do this for healthcare, we'll do this for consumer insights. We'll do. We even went up to logistics and supply chain, and then as we moved along, we realized it's about picking up a niche, because just a niche is actually a huge amount of work to do. I mean, if I were to say that I'll take up 4 industries and do everything within that, I think, I mean, we've realized it over the past 6 months that it's about picking up a niche and saying that we just specialize in this to start off with, and then as we go along, we kind of continue to increase our boundaries. But it is about picking up that niche and saying, I want to specialize just in this particular segment for now. Interesting. I think let's move on to the next segment, which is small data sets and big impact. I think there's an exciting shift again, and we've been obviously talking about that: more data, better data. Do we believe in small verified data sets? Can I mean, again, I think it probably is a repeat of the same question, is that small verified data sets of incentivized plus unincentivized behavior, can it unlock more powerful lifelike AI simulations? Do you think so?
I do. And I'll say this though, with kind of the background of, we got to remember how these models were created in the first place. And that is like very large, right, disparate data sets. So yes, can it happen? Absolutely. You can start with something small, you can expand upon that. But the reality is, a lot of that expansion isn't just purely like made up. It's not random, right? It's actually collected out in the real world. So probably step one for most of the industry will be gauging their tolerance on the level of inference or interpretation they want AI to make, right? So for us, what that kind of looks like is, we in our platform and services provide a control to our partner, to our user. And it's essentially the level of synthetic, or the amount of synthetic data used to populate those gaps in knowledge about that thing. So we have our own proprietary data sets, right, that we collect. And again, back to your point about standards, biases, right? We've attempted, and I'm not saying it's perfect. I don't think there's anything perfect in the world that eliminates bias. But we've taken our best shot, right? And we'll continue to improve upon that on helping eliminate that bias and getting a holistic quality data set. If I were to take something like an OpenAI model out of the box today, and I use that as essentially a way to expand upon my seed, which is that one very high quality data set, you will see yield on that, right? You will realize dividends. But you will get to also a point where you get too much almost synthetic data filling the gaps.
Yeah.
And there becomes this begging question of, okay, where did it come from? Is it real now?
Yes.
Right? Yeah, you're really kind of pushing that tolerance line. And so again, I think it comes down to tolerance. I do firmly believe in what you're saying is true. And the reason it works is because it's not just fake data, right? Synthetic data is not just fake. It's not just made up, right? It's based on real world modeled behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when we say small but rich data, I think we're not just talking about fewer rows. I think we're talking about deeper context, right? I mean,
True.
it's data that captures behavior, it captures motivation, it captures the environment, and all of this at once, right? So again, just going back to my OTT example, and like I was saying that the example I was giving earlier, that we see a certain pattern, and then suddenly we see that this person doesn't has access to high-speed internet, and so the environment is also dictating the behavior. So I cannot say that this particular persona will always behave in a similar way. Now, when I change the environment, when I change a certain variable, the behavior kind of starts to fluctuate. So and I mean, I would tend to think that, if again, just coming back to doing surveys versus taking this behavioral data, even if you do, let's say, 10,000 you collect 10,000 responses, you might not be able to get this one nuanced behavior which says that what happens suddenly if my 5G becomes a 3G. So I think that kind of comes from the behavior pattern. So Frank, from your perspective, what's your definition of rich data when it comes to AI training? Like, what signals do you look for and say that, yes, this is enough, this data looks good to me?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, I think it should come out of that human's mouth, right? So we need to be able to verify that a real person said it out in the market. That has to be a valid starting point, right? I think anything less than that starts to immediately degrade and quality comes into question. I would say past that, really, we look at all data as like an opportunity. And this is an approach that I wouldn't say is necessarily orthodox, especially for a startup or like a new company. In fact, I would almost say it's like ill-advised in a lot of ways. But it was our approach, and it was kind of done by accident. The reality is you cast a wide enough net and you start to capture data around people with very clear criteria, by the way. So no PII, right? Things of that sort. You start to realize, like, if you can get to a certain sense of scale, you really will have a ton of different, very useful data. And what I mean by that is, like, you may have a synthetic respondent, right, or a digital twin that has very little usefulness or capacity. So they only know about like one thing. Now, is that digital twin or that synthetic respondent useful in a certain use case? Absolutely. Particularly around the thing that it gave information about, right? So whatever the feedback was, whatever that topic was. But when you get to a certain sense of scale, you start to realize, like, wow, I have some really robust data, right, on X number of these synthetic respondents or digital twins. And that really becomes a secret sauce. So again, while I wouldn't advise quantity or scale for everybody in every use case, right, I think it works for us because it allows us to identify pockets of really rich, high quality data. And we have, a lot of digital twins that don't have that level of robustness, but as long as you know which ones do and which ones don't, they allow you to effectively use them in the variety of use cases and objectives that come up. So that's kind of been our approach, which may be a little different.
Yeah, interesting that you say that you basically take all kinds of data. Well, we haven't really thought that ways, and we've been still trying to, like, let's get the best data that we possibly can. But and then, I mean, it kind of leads to my next question is then how do you filter for signals versus the noise when it comes to that data, right? I mean, and when we say that we don't want to take all kinds of data in, I mean, that is also one of our hardest challenges, is knowing what is meaningful versus what is not, right? And what is noise versus what is the data that I actually need. So I mean, I think we kind of work on building those frameworks and context. So how do you do that? Like, how do you separate signal from noise, especially when user, I mean, behaviors, it's messy, emotional, it's unpredictable. So how do you kind of identify signal from noise?
I think from our perspective right now, it comes down to and again, I always want to give this vantage point. It may be very different for other partners. So I'll preface it with that. For us, it comes down to, we can run thousands, if not millions, of simulations, right, in minutes. So determining signal versus noise is challenging, right? And it will always be for every partner. I think, again, this is going to be terrible for the person that's listened to this entire episode. It really comes down to that North Star again, right? Your business outcome is what helps you determine signal versus noise. And so you're not always going to determine signal correctly. In fact, like, I'm going to be honest, like, there are times I'm sure that we are giving a little bit of noise rather than signal, and that is difficult to identify. But there are things, again, in those milestones that you can do to account for signal versus noise, such as How do I identify fraudulent behavior? How do I identify repeat comments or feedback, right? And so those are some of the early things that you can do from really a fraud or I would say kind of a signal detection perspective that really help you get to signal by the time you get to the end, right, of that simulation. There's definitely a bunch of stuff kind of upfront that companies, not only us, I'm sure, are doing, such as yourself, right, to kind of chip away at biases or noise, not signal. But yeah, I think it really comes down to this. You will have a batting average, right? Let's talk baseball. You will have a batting average as a company on the number of signals you predicted and then how well those signals resulted in business outcome. That batting average is going to be what, essentially tells me that, again, this approach is better than that, or your approach is better than mine. And so that's what I think we should probably all be concerned about. And we just need partners to trust in our methodology and our rigor along the way. And so I think you're seeing a lot of that willingness to collaborate and experiment, which is fun because it should result in a much better world for everyone. But yeah, that batting average is probably most important.
Makes sense. And I think that kind of gives us the assurance that for a startup like us, we might falter here and there for now, but hopefully we are reaching the right direction with all the hiccups that we get along the way. But with this then, because we're talking about small data sets, rich data sets, context driven data sets rather than the numbers, do you think could this change how we evaluate sample size in research? I mean, fundamentally, to our point, this kind of challenges how we define statistical confidence, right? Like if AI can interpolate and simulate based on richer inputs, maybe 500 deep signals are better than 5,000 shallow ones, right? So do you think it pushes us to move away from that n size obsession? And do you think it forces researchers to rethink their whole approach to sampling and confidence?
I think so. Yeah. Look, I think your approach is an intelligent one for sure, right? Focusing on maybe smaller, high quality. And we haven't discussed in our previous conversations like exactly what vertical or industry you're focused in, but I can imagine a world where, pharmaceuticals, right, they're traditionally dealing with small sample sizes anyway, right? Yeah. And so, that's an area where, again, quality is, held in top regard, right? And that smaller data set actually might have a much more effective outcome than going widespread, because we know those audiences are traditionally much harder to reach depending on the drug or the pharmaceutical. I would say in other industries, maybe not necessarily, right? Looking at something like CPG, where you need much greater representation because the addressable market is so much larger, right? It's like that might be a case where, again, small isn't necessarily better. So this is where I think, again, not a one size fits all approach works. But yeah, I'm with you. Like, I think the approach that you all have taken there makes a ton of sense for specific industries and use cases. And there's going to be countless others, right, that maybe it doesn't necessarily have as much of an impact. But statistical significance is always a funny one. I think at the very least, we could very easily lean into creating enough synthetic sample, if you will, that we would, 10x, right, whatever traditional sample is. And I think that's very achievable, to your point. So yeah, I'm not really bought in on this idea of like in size being like the most important thing. But yes, will it change our perspective? Well, it'll change your perspective if we view the synthetic respondent as an equivalent to a human respondent, then absolutely. But in reality, we're probably using hundreds or thousands of humans to get to the synthetic respondent. And therefore, the sample as we present it isn't necessarily true, right, to like what it took to actually get to that digital twin or that synthetic sample.
Exactly. And also I think from driving insights perspective, it doesn't, if I have a small data set that I'm comparing against and saying, okay, so I have 50 data points, and because I can extrapolate and create synthetic data, I'll make that 50 to 50,000. I mean, I don't think that works either, right? At some point, the model would start to fail, right? So there has to be a X of like, if I have 50, I can probably take it to, I don't know, 500, 250 maybe. And then I think we'll also have to figure out that where does the model basically start to fail as well. So yeah, I mean, it's not that I have access to generating synthetic data, so I can just generate human population altogether, right? So interesting, Frank. I think let's get to the last bit of it, which is best practices and how do we integrate all this into the real world, right? So let's talk about integrations from teams wanting to blend synthetic data with real data. I mean, where do they even start? I mean, what are the most common mistakes that you think they make?
I think, most common mistakes are just like definition right now, right? I mean, we've done a pretty good job, and there's organizations like SMR who have done a fairly proactive job at like defining what synthetic data is. And so, for instance, I had a partner, a fairly large partner, that came to me and he said, hey, they were actually evaluating us. So this wasn't even a deal yet, right, that we had closed. Or a company that we had partnered with. But he said, hey, why don't you explain the difference between synthetic data and something like digital twins for me, right? And just do it in like plain English. Like, I'm a kid, just explain it. And so I gave the example at the very beginning of our webinar today. But, I said, you remember the movie Jurassic Park? Okay. If anyone remembers it, it's one of my favorite films. I geek out on it. But there was a legendary man named John Hammond. And John Hammond and his team were the ones that, again, created these dinosaurs. Synthetic data, the definition is a raw material, right? It's just essentially like a building block. And we use those building blocks to fill in a gene that ultimately helps us build a full DNA strand to then create a dinosaur, or essentially the system that is a digital twin.
Right.
So in this brand new world that we've all found ourselves in, I think it's clear that we provide like industry definition about what is synthetic data, what is a digital twin, and then like what is it that Acutus, right, is offering to market. And so I think that's part of the problem right now, lack of definition. The other thing that I've seen is too much emphasis. Honestly, and I say this and it might actually hurt us as I say it. Maybe too much emphasis on the parity between human responses and digital twins as an initial point of validation. I think it should be done, and we continue doing it through all of our engagements. But I think the mistake is, if I was a partner or a client and all we had to do is show you parity between humans and digital twins, then, I could be very successful. And, we're very honest about those results. So there's, varying results sometimes between digital twin responses and the human responses that the digital twins are supposed to represent. But my question always comes back to, if I told you I could give you 100% parity, but 95% of your new products still failed, or if I told you that digital twins were a little bit different than humans, but, now only 50% of your new products failed, like, which one would you choose, right? And so I think the philosophical question is like, parity is great, right? If we have synthetic data that helps digital twin or synthetic respondent answer like a human, that's awesome. But way more awesome is I can tell you I can boost your sales or help you create a better successful product. So I think that's one of the mistakes, that like people only look this far as to like what validation really means, when really they should be looking a couple steps down the road, right, at like the true business KPI or outcome.
Yep, makes sense. I think, that makes sense. If we just make a clone and they deliver the same results, then, I mean, essentially, I don't change anything. I can just still go back to doing things that I've been doing the whole way, right?
Absolutely.
Interesting. I mean, where I also see a lot of teams struggle, and I think this is to your point as well, is like, what do I choose? An exact replica or some the end better result? What's the framework? I mean, how do you balance this creativity with credibility, right? What's your framework for mixing science and imagination when you're building these synthetic personas?
Yeah, we take a few different methods. So, for more of our super users, we'll call them, right? Like traditional career researchers, we'll provide them with control.
Okay.
Right. We'll say, hey, why don't you go experiment, right? And a lot of times, like, they love the experimentation. We're happy to support. We're happy to provide a level of service that hopefully exceeds anything they've ever seen before. But in a lot of cases, they want to figure, these are very curious, right, and capable individuals. They want to figure out on their own. So you put the control in their hands. You say, hey, you go run your own validation. You'll go run your own tests. And that's what they'll come back with. In terms of like the recipe that we talked about earlier, right, to make that Michelin star dish,
Right.
I think that's a bit of a case by case. The nice part is, as the platforms, like yours, like mine, as they get to a state of maturity, you can run quite a few tests, and with different blends or different formulations of synthetic versus real versus alternative data.
Yeah.
And so you can run those side by sides in a proof of concept. And what you'll find is one of those recipes are going to have a better result than others. So that's really what we've tried to allow, is the flexibility and the unit economics to run like multiple tests using multiple recipes or formulations of synthetic versus real versus alternate. And then you pick the best one, right? And so it comes down to not only an economics thing, but a speed thing. So that's where something like compute GPU comes in, or maybe even like the UX UI, right? How easy is it to go out and execute that stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what it is. And as our website says, we are experimenting, and I think that's where it is right now. Which all of us are experimenting. I don't think anybody has a set formula to that recipe, right? We just try
a crystal ball yet.
Exactly. And I mean, also what I think is like when we're building these workflows and trying to do it without overcomplicating, I think in theory we're just combining real and synthetic data. I mean, obviously when you're doing this, it sounds exciting, but in practice, I think it obviously, when you talk to researchers or when you talk to clients, it also kind of overwhelms them. They think of it, too many tools, too many steps to do different things. And I think when I talk to clients when we're doing POCs and stuff, I think we try to keep it simple. We say it's like observe, extract, simulate, validate, and then repeat the same process again. I mean, just keep it lean and effective. Like you said, just try and see what works and what not, what doesn't, what is the end final result, and how good is it for your business and your ROI. I mean, what does a good hybrid workflow look like in your experience? Like one that's powerful and still manageable?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we were to kind of hedge against, let's say we have tons of skeptics, right? I think the skeptic group has decreased over time, especially over the last year. But there's a lot of skeptics on synthetic data and its power. But I agree with your keeping it simple, at least from an explanation perspective. In a lot of ways, this is novel, but not necessarily from like a methodology perspective. And what I mean by that is, methodologies and systems like Fusion have existed for quite a while.
Yes.
Right. And like, I don't think if we wanted to like really simplify this, right, like what we're doing isn't much different than Fusion. What I think part of the power is like you can just do that way faster, and you can iterate way faster, and then you can simulate too. So you've added like foresight to the equation potentially, right? That's something that needs to be measured for accuracy over time. But yeah, I think it's the system almost that's more important right now than necessarily like the synthetic data. It's like, okay, I need a system that allows me to plug in or plug out synthetic data very quickly and determine what mix is going to create the best result. So yeah, I love your approach. I think, it's one that speaks to me and resonates with our company because, you come in with an objective as a partner of ours. We'll show you a few ways you can approach it, and we'll develop a POC. You can essentially approach that in all 3, 4, 5 ways very cost effectively. And then that becomes kind of your baked in validation, because you'll have an outcome at the end And that I think is what's potentially most valuable here.
Absolutely, Frank. I mean, I think I agree to this, and I mean, I think that's one of the practical advice I think to early adopters is don't wait for the perfect data. I think start small with I mean, figure out what you really want to understand, and then build it to simulate a few journeys and learn fast. And I think, I mean, for me, I think this space kind of rewards iteration and not perfection. So
Yeah.
I think it's a continuous process of keeping on iterating and building it better as you go along, and not wait for the perfect perfect simulation, I would say. I mean, I think Frank, last bit of advice from you. I mean, what's one thing you wish more early adopters did, or even, let's say, avoided when starting with AIs and synthetic personas?
I think you kind of touched on it at the end, but I would not be paralyzed by data readiness, especially as an enterprise. I think there's a fair amount of warranted, hesitation, or even hesitation as much as meticulous care. And what I mean by that is like, hey, you got to make sure your security protocols are solid, right? You got to make sure that InfoSec is rock solid. Make sure the data set doesn't include PII, right, with a lot of this experimentation. But I wouldn't let data readiness paralyze you for the same reasons we discussed the entire session, right? Like, I think all data has value. If you can find a partner in a system that can make better use of that data that is essentially sitting there on the shelf, stale, right? Like, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity to gain a competitive advantage. So that's just one thing I would preach is like, I wouldn't, to your point, you don't need the crystal ball as a partner right now to experiment with AI cheaply, effectively, and quickly. And I think that advice is probably the best, right? Because the ones that do take that leap are probably going to find a competitive advantage much faster than others. And maybe, I don't know, kind of win the race, if you will.
Right. Makes sense. Frank, what an incredible conversation. I mean, thank you so much for your insights, your clarity, and your willingness to explore the gray areas of AI with data and in such depth. I'm not sure if we have any questions at this point. I'm sure people are just taking in. There's lots to digest, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think if there's one clear takeaway today, I think future of research insights, I mean, AI driven insights, it's not about choosing between real respondents, synthetic ones, validated ones. I think it's the power of and. I think it's all about collaboration, blending high quality real world behavior with creative power of simulation, and like you said about the dinosaurs example, right? Just filling in and making that entire thing come to life, basically, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that's really insightful. For all of you, those in listening in, whether you're a researcher, innovator, or decision maker, I think I hope that this has sparked some curiosity, maybe even a shift in mindset. I mean, the door's open. You don't have to wait for the perfect conditions. Like I said, just start experimenting. Yeah, and for us at Acutus, this is just the start of an ongoing series where we'll deep dive into AI, digital twins, and Frank, just to answer your context, I think we've kind of now, we were all over the place when we started healthcare, AI, logistics, whatever. I think we found our niche. I think we found our niche in the Gen Z space to start off with, users in context and much more. So these sessions will happen every Tuesday. So feel free to join in. You can go to our website, acutusai.com, or you can subscribe on our LinkedIn page, and you have all updates about our upcoming webinars as well. And Frank, finally, thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everyone who's joined us live today. Keep experimenting.
Thank you. It's great. Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Have a good one.